Hello, Michael, and welcome to Talking to Thinkers.
Nice to be here, Johnny.
Great. Um, Michael, on your personal website, you describe yourself as a writer, historian, professor, and politician. So before we start looking at the beginning of your life and work from there, I'd maybe just like to talk about the order of that self-description. I assume it's not random.
Um, I think I put writer first because I think from my earnest, self-important teenage years, I was jotting things in a diary, and I've been keeping a diary on and off for close to 60 years. And I think I'm one of these people who hasn't experienced anything until I've written it down. I think there are limits to that, of course. I mean, there are some experiences so wonderful and so terrific you don't feel like writing them down. And then there's some experiences so bloody awful you don't want to write them down. But most of the time, I kind of feel I haven't until I've tried to put it on the page. It sort of hasn't happened to me in some weird way. I don't praise this as an attitude. I think it may be rather deficient. My wonderful wife, I don't think, has the same impulse, and she lives a life probably better than mine, but I'm just stuck with this habit. I think I then became a historian very, very early. I see everything historically. I don't quite know why that is. I think it is partly because I come from on my mother's side, my grandfather was a historian of Canada, and I'm sort of proud of that association. And then on my father's side, they're White Russians, that is, Russians from the Tsarist era, and so the experience of going into exile and expatriation created a historical problem. How do you maintain the continuity of our historical experience? Why am I called Ignatieff, a Russian name? How did that happen? These are historical questions that I think then triggered a desire to be a historian. I can't remember what the next word was, but somewhere along the line, it does become politician. Um, I grew up in a family of civil servants. My father was a diplomat in a glorious period in Canadian history when Canadian diplomacy was led by a wonderful guy called Mike Pearson, who went on to invent peacekeeping and won the Nobel Prize. And my dad worked for him for nearly 40 years. And so I grew up in a public service household of kind of earnest, not much money, but terribly uncynically proud to work for the country. I mean, that really was my father. And he was a immigrant boy from Russia. And he was in some ways the first immigrant to rise that high in the Canadian Foreign Service. So he had a kind of completely uncynical view of the country, which I think it was passed on to me. But because he was a diplomat, we grew up in all kinds of places around the world. So I grew up in Washington and New York and Paris and London. It was a fantastically privileged childhood in that sense, and wonderfully lucky. But it sort of destabilized my connection to Canada. We were very loyal Canadians, but we were never there. And that that pattern has continued for the rest of my life. And eventually, it led me to think I should go back home and try my hand at politics. And I did. And I ran for the Parliament of Canada in 2005 and was elected thanks to the help of a lot of wonderful young people. And then I ran for the leadership, and I didn't win that time, but I became leader in 2009. And then I led the party into a very massive defeat in 2011, and in a way, fortunately, lost my seat. So my continuation in politics is impossible. And so I returned to being a professor very happily. I didn't feel in some ways that I was well suited to politics. I think there was some illusion in my idea that I would be good at it. I was good at some bits of it, but pretty bad at others, and came away, in fact, with a paradoxical respect for politicians. If you've been in the arena, you stop being as critical of politicians because you realize what a bloody awful job it is in some ways. So I came out with a respect for politicians and an awareness that I didn't have some of the skills that were required to get me the next stage, which would have been prime minister. So I returned to academic life very happily and went back into the classroom at Harvard, and then eventually took the job as rector and president of CEU, Central European University in Budapest, and then found myself tumbled into another political battle because Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, wanted to throw us out of Hungary, and we fought that as hard as we could. It was a really important battle for academic freedom in Europe, but you can't indefinitely defy the elected government of a country, whatever you think of it. And so we had to relocate to Vienna. And now that's why, Johnny, I'm talking to you from Vienna, where I'm now a professor of history in the history department at the university that I used to lead.
Okay, very good. Well, that's very nice snapshot of your life. And we're going to talk about most of those themes you touch upon there, because it has been a fascinating life, and one in many ways that mirrors your life, the world in which you lived. So let's maybe go back to the beginning. And you were born in Toronto in 1947. Right. You've mentioned there a little bit about your lifestyle. You're the son of a diplomat, but can you talk about growing up in Toronto and other places and your pre-university years?
Well, I was I had two wonderful parents. I do want to, without going on about it, my dad was a big, tall Russian aristocrat from another era who lost everything in the revolution with his family and then reinvented himself as a Canadian, but always carried a sort of certain English accent, a certain savoir-faire that I admired. I loved the guy. He was a irascible, difficult father, but he was a tremendous. He did the thing that matters, which is that he conveyed deep, passionate love for people. And that was my dad. My mother was the daughter of a schoolmaster in Toronto, from a very kind of the Anglo-Canadian intellectual elite of the time. And she was, in some sense, I don't mean it disparagingly, she's kind of the ugly duckling of a very high-powered family. And she had dyslexia, and she never really finished high school. But she was an incredibly creative woman. And the fact that she had difficulty getting the words out never stopped her. And in a way, she was the most formative intellectual influence of my life. To cue forward, when I began writing this book on Consolation, we may talk about later, one of the chapters is about Albert Camus. Why? Because my mother introduced me to Camus in the 60s, and she gave me his notebooks from the period 1941 to 1945, and they're inscribed by my mother. So she was a tremendous driver of my intellectual curiosity, and she was funny and witty and loved singing Judy Garland songs, and just a charming woman who then unfortunately developed Alzheimer's disease later in life. And that's, I think, the great drama of my family life, that my mother got sick in her early 60s, which is early onset Alzheimer's, and died in her early 70s, and spent 10 years going into the darkness and the fog. And that, I think, shaped my life and my father's life very, very deeply. And my father looked after her as best he could, but predeceased her, I think, basically because he just couldn't take the strain of dealing with someone who was very demented. But he was courageous, and he did his very best. So that's kind of the story. I have not answered the question of what it was like to grow up with these. And it was a bit overwhelming in a way because they were very commanding and rather successful people. And I aspired to, live up to them. And I have a younger brother, and I think it was a little tougher for my brother, who felt a bit crushed by my father, whereas I basked in my father's approval. I went to ordinary Canadian public schools. I have vivid memories of some of the happiest memories of my life were very, very early ones of walking to school on my own in Ottawa in the 50s when it's 40 below zero. And I'm completely, hooded up like a little spaceman, walking through streets that are still dark, listening to that wonderful Canadian sound, the sound of crunching snow under your feet and the stillness in the air, and noticing that the stop signs, the very stop signs, are covered with snow, and that the snow is higher than you are. So it's a wonderful memory, and feeling completely secure. It's bloody cold. I don't know why it didn't bother me, but at 7 or 8 years old, you're a happy guy. And I enjoyed school. I think I was a little kind of lonely, thoughtful, earnest, but I don't have any bad memories of school. And then my parents began to travel a lot. And so at that point, I was sent to a boys' private school, Upper Canada College, which was a kind of typical English boarding school, which I spent 6 years in, and I have ambivalent feelings about it because it had some kind of bullies, and there was a certain amount of abuse of boys that we didn't even grasp in the 60s. And so I'm angry about that in a way, because I think the school should have seen. I was never abused and I was never bullied. I was rather proud of being caned once, the old style. But there was an atmosphere of kind of suppressed violence, at least among some. It was also, let's be perfectly clear, since there may be graduates of this school listening, it was also a bloody good school. I mean, I learned Latin, I learned Greek, and it stayed with me all my life. And I had an absolutely extraordinary history teacher who, I still think of with affection. I had a wonderful English teacher who taught me to love Shakespeare and tracked us teenage boys through King Lear one whole semester. That was one of the formative experiences of my life. I've written about King Lear all my life as a result. So that was my childhood, extremely privileged, very elite in all those ways. But there were some good values taught to us. We weren't taught that we'd inherited the world. We weren't taught that we were the master class. We were taught we had to earn it. And then I went on to University of Toronto. But that's my story, Johnny.
Okay, very good. Did life come easy to you? Did you find school intellectually easy? Did you find socializing with your peers easy?
I was terrible at math and not very good at science. And so I actually had to have remedial stuff. And I had a lisp early in my life, which a tiny trace of it remains. And I do remember at primary school having a candle put in front of my face and speaking so that I wouldn't blow the candle out, and learning, to get the front of my face under some kind of control. So I must have had a little more difficulty than I remember. I do remember being very, very backward in math, and I still am. And I have a kind of math anxiety, which my wife regards quite rightly as absurd. And so, but she does all the bills as a result. Some things, on the other hand, I felt a natural affinity for, like English and history. and loved those and just felt, oh my, this is just, and I think learned a certain very romantic view of history as being about great men and occasionally great women and great causes and all that stuff. So it's a very romantic, I think, rather 19th century view of history, which had to be revised when I actually began to learn some real history when I went to university. Did I make friends early? I still have some friends from high school that I remember with great affection, and some of them I'm still in touch with. So I must have made friends. I think I don't think as I look back, I like myself terribly as a young fellow, as a teenager. I think I was what they would call a prig, very sure of myself, a little arrogant, sort of, very ambitious, always getting prizes and stuff like that. I don't look back on that with much affection. I think I was overdue for a bit of a kicking by life, and when it came, that was basically good for me. I did have a sense always that did things come easy? Some things came easy, but some things came hard. I mean, I was lucky, very lucky with early girlfriends. I feel that just is a piece of luck, really. Nothing is more important to an adolescent boy than, having romantic success either with men or with women. And I had a wonderful early girlfriend, which I think made a tremendous difference to my sense of, self and stuff, and my initiation into sexual life and all that stuff. It was, I think in that way, I was just incredibly lucky, because you can have a kind of bad early encounter and it just messes everything up. But wherever she is, I salute you and thank you for what I learned from you.
Very good. I mean, so fortune looked kindly on you in the main in those early years, you could say. And in that sense, I suppose you could say going to university was a natural step. Was that something that was almost presumed within your family and at school, that you would go to university?
Oh yeah, it was taken for granted. My father was essentially made by the University of Toronto. He came as an immigrant in 1928 to Russia, and by 1935 he was an Ontario Rhodes Scholar at Trinity College, the college at the university that I then attended. So yes, it was just slotted right in, and I did history. And again, the University of Toronto is a very good place, and the history department is a very, very good department. And there were some people who turned out to be some of the great historians of our time, like Natalie Zeman Davis, who's the great historian of the Renaissance period. And people like that just really did turn the lights on. I can remember feeling a sort of physical sense of excitement as an undergraduate. It was also the Vietnam era, so I spent a lot of time out of the class marching against the war, which I thought was, there were two kinds of opposition to the war, and I belong very firmly in the camp of those who believed that this was a betrayal of America's best ideals. That's kind of liberal objection to the war. Then there were kind of anti-capitalists, anti-militarist opponents to the war. And I learned to march with people much further to the left of me who I didn't agree with, but we were marching in the same cause. And I think that was very formative to my understanding of politics. You're always, marching with people you don't really agree with very much, but you're allies. And that sense of the importance of having allies across disagreement seemed to me to be something I did learn at the university. And it was a tremendously exciting time. All the cliches about, Wordsworth, blessed was was in that dawn. I mean, it really did feel like it. I turned 21 in 1968, as Paris blew up, as, the marches on Washington. I took part in one march in Washington in 1972, and that kind of anti-war liberalism was very, it was a very formative time.
Because that is, liberalism is one of those kind of enduring features of your life, and even you're saying there, it obviously kicked in quite early. You even took that liberal critique of Vietnam War, and you weren't someone that kind of wanted to dismiss everything at the extreme end. Was that something was it a liberal humanism? Were you ever tempted by religion? Was this something that came from your parents? Where was the origins of this liberal ethos?
Well, I think one thing to say about liberalism is that it comes in a lot of varieties, national varieties, that are very important. We tend to talk about liberalism as if it's one thing across all the democracies, and it's just not. The Canadian liberalism is very, very different from American liberalism. And I'm a Canadian liberal, which means that I believe in a national healthcare system. I believe in pensions. I believe in, above all, I believe in maintaining a political community across many different languages, and chiefly the French language, but also Aboriginal languages and Aboriginal cultures. Canada is a very distinctive experiment in liberal democracy because we're the second largest, democracy by size in the world, with 1/10 of the population of the United States. And so just keeping this thing together has been an enormous effort. So as Margaret Atwood says, we're cued to the issue of survival. We're just holding the show together means that the politics converges inevitably towards compromise, towards duck and difficult issues. So there's a sort of slightly shameful aspect of Canadian liberalism, but it's tremendously geared to the experience of living across difference. It's one of the reasons we've made a phenomenal success of immigration, unlike many European societies. We're just, we've been taking them in for, and as I turned 20, we suddenly changed our immigration policy and began admitting Caribbean, Asian, African immigrants, and from the subcontinent of India. And, someone like me who grew up as a white middle-class person in Toronto thought the whole world was like me. Well, in about 15 years, I will be a minority in my own hometown. And that's actually gone really well. There's no problem. There's no white rage that seems to be convulsing the United States, that we're losing our majority position, which fuels so much of Trump. So the liberalism I grew up on is again would be unrecognizable to anybody else. It's Mike Pearson's liberalism. Mike Pearson was the prime minister of the country between 1962 and 1968. He never had a majority government. He did everything holding on by his fingernails, but he built the social welfare state that makes us a semi-decent society, and acknowledged the reality of our Quebecois brothers that kept the country together. And we have produced this extraordinary binational state, so that when I was in the Parliament of Canada, every time I got up to speak in the Parliament, my first words were always in French, to accord respect to our Quebecois brothers and sisters. And the other feature of this, very unusual, is that sitting literally next to me in Parliament was a separatist member of the Bloc Québécois, which is committed to break up the Federation. We admit into the Parliament of Canada people who are committed to break up the Federation and who draw a very good pension from the federal government of Canada, being committed to break up the federal government of Canada. And that's how we keep the show on the road. Now, I say all this because that tells you that Canadian liberalism is different than American liberalism, is different from the liberalism that you find in the United Kingdom and from France. And France, Le libéralisme is very far right-wing monetarist Thatcherism in some descriptions. So as we understand liberalism, I want to put back into the national specificity of it. And for another reason, which is that you can't win an election preaching some anodyne universalism that's supposed to appeal to everybody. You've got to speak to, you've got to make the lyre of the national memory begin to resound, and I'm sure, you're a proud Irishman, and I'm sure there's a liberalism in Ireland that is completely constitutive of your battles to, work through the De Valera heritage, work through the heritage of a divided nation, work through the heritage of the power of the Catholic Church. All of that makes Ireland's liberalism really specific to Ireland. And this is the liberalism I now believe in, not a universal liberalism, but a national liberalism. Sorry to go on so long about it, but you twigged something that I think is pretty important.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I think you're right. I mean, I think liberalism is too often interpreted monolithically, and it's much more complex than that. And you've nicely exhibited that there. But just going back to your university and getting back into the narrative, I suppose, Michael, you obviously did well at Toronto. Because you went from there to Harvard, which is not an easy place to get into. Just before we talk about your academic pursuits in Harvard, can you recall what it was like arriving in Harvard, what that was like for a Canadian in the late 60s?
I arrived at Harvard in September 1969. And that's relevant for two reasons. First of all, in September 1969, the Harvard History Department accepted 45 PhD candidates. It turned out to be the largest cohort of admitted history candidates in the department. And from there on, it was downhill all the way. That is to say, that's important to my biographical narrative. I didn't realize it at the time, but we were assuming that the growth of the 50s and 60s would just continue indefinitely into the future. And therefore, I didn't even think about economic worries at all. I just thought I'd get a scholarship to Harvard, as I did, and I would get some job. And well, 69, 70, 71, 72, and then you have the oil shock, and it all goes down. And the number of PhDs going into history has declined, ever since. So that's fact number one. Fact number two is that in the spring of 69, Harvard had its most serious and divisive Harvard strike, in which students seized an administration building. And so I arrived at a university in September of 69 that was really in a much more traumatized state than I realized at the time. And you could see the effect of trauma in the kind of fury of the professoriate. I mean, they didn't want to see students. They thought this, I had pretty long hair at that point. They thought, oh my God, here comes another guy who's going to turf me out of my office. So the climate was very, very, very tense in a way that, again, I didn't quite realize at the time when I arrived. The third fact about coming to Harvard, which I think is something that almost everybody experiences. If you get into Harvard, you think you're pretty smart. Then you walk into a classroom and you just suddenly discover, and this was really the first experience that I'd had in my life, that everybody in the room is smarter, more interesting, and more articulate than you are. And that was a real wake-up call. Boom, boom. I had a really difficult time at Harvard because I just thought, I can't, I think I'm smart, but why do I feel so stupid all the time? So it was a struggle. Harvard was a struggle. The professors were in this kind of, keep these students away from us mood. So I felt the graduate training at Harvard was very bad. I was educated by my fellow students who were wonderful. Fortunately, again, I had fantastic fellow students, male and female, from all over the world and all over the country, some of whom have gone on to be very distinguished historians. And we educated ourselves. But I had a tough time. I failed my general exams, for example, which is a kind of, whoa, that was the first time I'd ever failed in an exam, but I had to do it a second time. I got through, eventually wrote my PhD and graduated, but it was a real growing up time. And there was a period, because it was also in the middle of the Vietnam War, when external events, the sense of a social crisis outside the walls of the university was so strong. You kept asking yourself, or you were sitting 3 floors down in the archives in the law school, you'd be thinking, what am I doing here? Shouldn't I be out in the streets fighting, the Nixon administration that just bombed Cambodia? Shouldn't I be, marching with my brothers and sisters? And I did, but the strain between university life and the political commitments outside was very great. So my memory of the Harvard years is one of enormous stress and strain and tremendous self-discovery. I really, a couple of times, thought I'm just going to jack in this PhD. It's too difficult, and I'm very glad that I persisted, but it was a real test of kind of nerve and intellectual stamina. So
it's I mean, I assume your PhD was the historical work on the penitentiaries. Is that right?
Yeah.
Which, when I saw it, I haven't read it. It's one of their books I haven't read, but it looks very Foucauldian, and Foucault was in the air. I mean, it's sort of the sort of book you'd think Foucault would write as well, and in a way,
yes, oddly it was influenced by Foucault, but I kind of don't like to be thought of Foucaultian, in the sense that there's just a lot about Foucault that I just think is not very interesting and not very true. The part about Foucault that I loved was there's kind of historical imagination at work in Foucault that's just, this incredible tour de force description of the execution of Damiens, the plotter against Louis XV, the ways in which he's torn apart in a public spectacle in 1750, whatever it was, as epitomizing the spectacle of punishment in the Ancien regime. I think Foucault's description of that is just a tour de force of the historical imagination. Actually, my book came from somewhere else that I haven't mentioned, which is that I spent every Tuesday night of my Harvard years in a medium security prison south of Boston called Walpole, MCI Walpole. And the Protestant chaplain of MCI Walpole had a lifers group for people, young, almost all young black men, who'd thrown their lives away at the age of 18, killing somebody, and then were in the tank for a long time. And on Tuesday night, the chaplain had these discussion programs in which, young people like me, naive, innocent, foolish people, came and talked to these black guys about everything, about sex, about marriage, about life, about punishment, about God, about this and that. And those were very, very formative experiences to spend every Tuesday night behind bars, the sense of the suffocation, the sense of people looking at the destruction of their own lives, the violence in the prison, the fear in the prison, but also the terrible sense of waste, because some of these young black men were so clever, so acute, such beautiful mastery of language, so brilliant, wonderful, and coarse, vulgar, but it was so exciting to listen to them talk about their lives and verbalize their experience. I've never forgotten it. And I think the book came out a lot out of that, much more than Foucault. There were other historians, a wonderful American historian called David Rothman, who was working on the history of the institution at that point. The other feature of the book was that it was looking at the counter-Enlightenment, the dark side of the Enlightenment, the paradox that my book was trying to investigate was, how was it that an enlightenment that had produced Beccaриa's, great denunciation of the cruelty of ancien regime punishment, how could it at the same time create a penitentiary regime based on solitude? And it was one of the earliest technologies for essentially behavior modification and psychic modification. And so the Enlightenment has this double side. It's liberating on the one hand and deeply coercive on the other. And I wanted to figure out, that's why the book is called A Just Measure of Pain. How could pain be just? That's what they're wrestling with. And some of the most important figures in the Enlightenment were at the center of the punishment battle, not just Jeremy Bentham, but Alexis de Tocqueville, many others. And so it was a project not just about prisons, it was a project about another way of thinking about the Enlightenment.
You mentioned there, the darker side of the Enlightenment. Had you at that point been exposed to the work of Isaiah Berlin, who talks about the two sides of the Enlightenment, or did that come later?
That came later. At this point, Isaiah Berlin is only a name to me, and I think I had possibly read his great essay on Tolstoy, and I'd read some of his Russian thinkers because of my so-called Russian background, but he was not. And my father knew Isaiah, so he was a. I remember at one point when my father was stationed in New York, Isaiah Berlin came to New York, and my father asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm giving a lecture at the John Jay College for Policemen." And my father said, "What are you going to talk about?" He said, "I think I'm going to talk to them about Machiavelli. Very good idea for policemen." So that was a kind of family joke, but I can't say I'd even met him at that point.
Okay, very good. So you got your PhD eventually. As you say, it wasn't a walk in the park in Harvard, but you then get your first teaching job in British Columbia, which you spend at for a while. And then after a brief period, you make your way to as a senior research fellow at King's College, Cambridge. When you look at the years you were there, kind of the late 70s to the early 80s, it was, from what I can see, a pretty magical time to be in King's College, Cambridge. You had so really amazing thinkers. Can you talk a little bit about what brought you there, brought you back to the old country, and brought you to Cambridge, and then maybe talk about your time there?
Well, I think I was, the push factors were that I was out in British Columbia, and while British Columbia was incredibly good for me, it's spectacularly beautiful. I did feel I was a hell of a long way from anywhere. I taught history, good department, but I just thought I felt I got to get out of here, and I possibly wrongly, but that's what I felt at the time. And so when Gareth Stedman Jones, who was a socialist historian I knew, and a fellow of King's, with John Donne, the great theorist of democracy, put together a project on the history of classical economic theory, I leaped at the chance to apply for this 6-year senior research fellowship that would study the origins and evolution of classical economic theory. Did I know anything about Adam Smith and classical economic theory? No, I didn't. Did I know something about the Enlightenment? Yes. And that's, I think, how I got the job, because I focused on this double-sided dark and light side of the Enlightenment, and wanted to take a more critical view of the Enlightenment, and that then made them interested in me as a possible candidate. So the other person who applied was the Hungarian historian of philosophy, István Hont, and together we worked for 6 years on a kind of new account of the origins of classical economic theory, which was some of the most exciting, purely intellectual work I've ever done, partly because István Hont was an infuriating colleague, unbelievably difficult, Hungarian, Hungarians are difficult. I married one, so I ought to know, but incredibly creative. The collaboration was frictional, difficult, but boy, did I learn a lot. And I think we produced a really startlingly new account of where classical economic theory came from, which is that it came out of jurisprudence. That is, Adam Smith was a teacher of jurisprudence to young 16-year-old Scots in Glasgow and then in Edinburgh. And in jurisprudence, there was a topos, there was a place for thinking about justice and the justice of pricing. And in that space, Adam Smith begins to think new thoughts, and he's in a commercial seaport, Glasgow. He begins to expose himself to the commercial economy of the 18th century, which, yes, also includes the hugely important commerce in slaves. He then also encounters Rousseau's discourse on inequality, which is a kind of subtext, an influence on the genesis of the Wealth of Nations that I don't think is, until we did this work, was fully understood, because in Rousseau's discourse on inequality that won him the prize of the Dijon Academy of Sciences in, I think, 1755, Rousseau says, the minute capitalism begins, the minute people begin planting and exporting and trading, inequality starts. And there's a fatal dialectic between the development of a capitalist market and inequality. And this idea that capitalism and inequality are fatally linked was, I think, the central challenge that Smith wants to think about and overcome. And if you look at literally the first chapter of The Wealth of Nations, why does it begin with a division of labor? Why does it begin with this famous analysis which says that thanks to the productivity of labor in a modern capitalist economy, the poorest day laborer in a capitalist economy lives better than the chieftain of an African tribe? There may be more relative inequality between classes as a result of capitalist economic development, but the productivity of labor creates a situation in which there is less absolute misery at the bottom, and the productivity of labor makes it possible for ordinary English laborers to live better than the richest people in pre-capitalist societies. And that's where the book starts. That's literally what the first chapter says. And I think once you see that, you see what the point of classical economic theory was, which was to understand the distributional consequences of capitalist economic development, and then to think about it on a global scale, that is, to think about the distributional consequences for what was then an empire. And so the theory of international trade that he develops comes out of that. And so we wanted to connect the growth of classical economic theory, to the jurisprudential topos that goes back to Grotius and Pufendorf and all those guys, and then to the Rousseauian critique of capitalism. And I think out of that, we produced the introduction to a book called Wealth and Virtue, which I think was an important contribution to understanding capitalism and understanding the origins of classical economic theory. And it had a big effect on my own liberalism. I mean, my liberalism is Smithian liberalism, because the other aspect of Smith that's wonderful is that while he's a defender of capitalist modernity, he's entirely disabused. I mean, all the famous remarks about, merchants cannot gather in a tavern before the conversation turns to the fixing of prices. All that kind of completely disabused, sociologically realistic understanding that, let's not sentimentalize this system. This is a system that needs to be understood in synoptic terms. And that's the other final feature of this. Both Hume and Smith are and remain the greatest social scientists of modernity. I mean, because they combine philosophy, history, economic analysis, and a deeply complex psychology that you get in the theory of moral sentiments. And no one before or since has ever put that package together in a comprehensive vision of what the human sciences can be. And yes, Cambridge was very exciting because Quentin Skinner was there, Amartya Sen was there, Bernard Williams was the master of my college and was an incredible inspiration. But the real inspiration was Hume and Smith. I mean, just spending time with them was a transformative intellectual experience for me.
Yes, I mean, one of the themes that's coming up in a lot of my interviews with the people I'm talking to is that, when they comment on where we are, but the academy is today, it's this hyper specialization, which Smith and Hume were they never even entered their mind. I mean, they were generalists with depth, which we've seen that they are rare birds these days. And in fact, the academy almost eliminates them before they even have a chance to emerge. So was that, and actually a lot of your writing has that kind of generalist purview. Was that there before?
I paid a bit of a price for that. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who think I'm not quite kosher academically, but I felt both at Harvard and at King's that I had learned to be a samurai warrior. That is, I'd learned to be to wield the weapons of scholarship, and I've never stinted in my respect for great scholarship. And Istvan Hont, who was a very different character than me, was a superlative scholar, and I have respect for its scholarship, but I also do feel that the model of Smith and Hume, some of the most penetrating essays on politics ever written were Hume's essays that were basically for the middle class public of the 1750s and 60s. He wrote in a kind of lucid, transparent public style, which remains I think, an influence on me to this day. I mean, needless to say, never get close, but and I also think that your earlier account, I slightly disagree with you, Johnny. I think there is a place for highly focused scholarship. I think that there are plenty of academics in 21st century academic life who are doing an exemplary job of communicating to the general public. I mean, just at random, Stephen Greenblatt's incredible stuff on Shakespeare reaches a very large audience. Steven Pinker's stuff on the psychology of rationality has a big audience. Anthony Appiah gets a very large audience. I could go on. So I think there's some formidable academic communicators out there who are regarded with respect by the pure scholars and who manage to get beyond. I don't feel the academy is captured by narrow specialists, and I also think that narrow specialists are essential. I think there is a problem, which is that the humanities increasingly and the social sciences are falsely modeling their methodologies on the natural sciences and their publication strategies on the natural sciences. And so the social sciences are doing a lot of experiments, essentially collecting data. And some of the data-driven stuff seems to me to be, again, very illuminating, because it's long overdue to replace anecdote and supposition with actual data about human behavior. I mean, I just don't think there's any way around it. And so someone like me, who's lousy at maths, can't do a quantitative experiment if my life depended on it. I don't think I'm well positioned to decry the quantitative turn in social sciences or the increasingly specialized turn. I don't do either of these things, but I don't think you can have a vigorous academic culture unless you have this. And the kids, as it were, will push this to the limit, and then they will hit the wall, because the wall they will hit is that there's some questions that cannot be answered with these methods. That's all. Yeah. And so, but there's room in the end for everybody, is my view of academic life, provided that everybody has a genuine respect for truth, for evidence, for facts. That's what matters. And that means we all ought to be united against the charlatans.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, maybe it's a false dichotomy, but the one thing I did want to touch upon there when you were talking about the, working with this Van Hunt on wealth and virtue, because was that book a self-consciously contextual, this kind of contextual approach that was in Cambridge at the time, or were you kind of, it may have been contextual, but it wasn't at the front of your mind?
Well, you couldn't be in Cambridge in 1980 without falling under the influence of Quentin Skinner and his approach to intellectual history, which is to say, of Locke of Locke, try and find out what question he wants to answer. Try and find out what the situation is in which Locke finds himself. And once you recover that context, you can begin to understand the text in a way that, if you simply take late 20th century, early 21st century perspectives on liberalism, you'll simply miss what Locke's problem situation was. And I think that's, 100% true. And it certainly affected our approach to Smith and Hume. In other words, instead of reintegrating Smith into the history of economic thought, in which Smith is a kind of imperfect forerunner of Samuelson and didn't quite get to where, Milton Friedman got on money, but he got close, so we'll give him it's a ridiculous approach to the history of ideas. You go back to what Smith is really thinking about, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the challenge of this vision of the fatal dialectic between commerce and inequality. And so I do think recovering that had the odd effect of, in my view, making him more relevant, because we're still deeply troubled, and should be deeply troubled, by the complex relationship between capitalism and inequality, because it's threatening the very legitimacy of most liberal democracies. And so it's interesting to note that a great theorist was thinking about this as far back as 1776.
Actually, when you mentioned that kind of crazy anachronism, remind me, and you mentioned Bernard Williams, he was quite amusing on this, where I think he said, you know, things have got so ridiculous in the history of philosophy that we're giving out to the Greeks for inventing triremes when they should have been really more of a precursor to the steamship.
Yeah, yeah,
It gets kind of so crazy.
yes, yes, yeah,
Um, going back to that period, so it wasn't just Wealth and Virtue that came out at that time. Shortly after that was your own book, The Needs of Strangers,
yeah,
and which kind of came, I think, towards the end of your period at
yeah.
Cambridge. It's a small but lovely little book. What made you write that, and do you think it was successful in what it tried to do?
Well, it was a, in a way, it was my declaration of independence from academic life. In a way, I, I ended the project at Cambridge thinking I wanted to take a break from academic life. I wanted to get out. I was beginning to be offered broadcasting opportunities on Channel 4 and BBC Two and stuff, and that was going to actually take the next 15 years of my life, one way or the other. But I loved the work I'd done at Cambridge, and so I wanted to kind of put together some essays on intellectual history and kind of tie them together. And I'm not sure I succeeded, but the book begins with a description of looking out my window in Chapel Market in Islington and seeing people. It's a scene that I think has now disappeared, of people, old age pensioners, ruffling through a market stall trying to find clothes that they can put on, and sensing the distance between myself watching them and these old folks, and it set me off on a kind of set of complicated thoughts about solidarity. How do we maintain or keep solidarity in market societies? Those are questions crucial to Hume and Smith, particularly in the theory of moral sentiments. They couldn't imagine a society held together simply by the cash nexus, as Marx was to call it. They thought there was a whole extremely complicated psychology of empathy, sympathy, mutual communication, which they were really the first to think through. And so looking down at that market stall, I could begin to see the deep relevance of some of Smith and Hume's thoughts to the present day. And I think that's where the book generated. And it also fixed in me a form of writing that has turned out to be the form of writing I like best, which is essays. I think I'm an essayist, and I think it was in The Needs of Strangers that I discovered that I was an essayist. It's what I love doing most, sort of 5,000, 6,000 word essay that trying to pull things together. And that's the form, in fact, that my current project on Consolation has taken. I don't quite know why. I like the linked essay, but that's the form that I developed in that book and have continued in some ways ever since.
I mean, when I reread that recently to prepare for this interview, two things really jumped out at me was, first of all, you catch the ambivalence of modernity, I thought, very nicely. And I thought it would actually be a dated book, but it hasn't nearly dated as badly as I thought it might have.
Well, that's not good to say. So I hope it, I mean, that's what we're all trying to do, to have something that has, look at the shelves behind you, that stays on the shelves,
Yeah.
But it's also very much a creature of its time. It was written in the middle of Thatcherism, in which Thatcher was kind of pounding British society and kind of shaking it upside down until the coins fell out. And everybody was asking a question of how this place holds together as you strip down the welfare state, as you crush the unions, as you do all the moving of the furniture that she was doing. The question of social solidarity was very urgent of its time. Now in 2021, we have the same question, but it's posed in a different context. And I think the reality is this is the question of modernity itself, the question of how it holds together. These are highly individualized societies. They are highly desacralized societies. They are highly globalized. The question of their coherence, and beyond their coherence, the degree to which they can demonstrate the solidarity we have to have in order to live a human life. It's been on trial, as Leszek Kolakowski said, for 200 years. And in a way, the Human Smith account is the most optimistic account we've ever had of that possibility of solidarity. But the solidarity is more and more problematic. And we're going through a crucial test of solidarity right now in COVID. I mean, it's testing everything about the solidarity of our societies, and we don't know how the experiment's going to turn out.
Yes. And I think, when you read that book, and actually, I think it's very interesting to read your book, that book, The Needs of Strangers, along with Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, because he hits upon this theme as well as you do, this kind of inarticulacy that goes with modernity, our inability to, and actually unwillingness really, to spell out what this solidarity is in case we go to somewhere really dark. And yet it's that very unwillingness that holds us back from actually fulfilling the positive side of modernity. Mm-hmm. So I think both you and Taylor, and his book came out later, kind of are quite nice, complement each other.
I think they are products of the same era, no question. Great man.
Two Canadians.
Canadians. What a great man he is, boy.
Yeah.
A tremendous amount from Charles Taylor.
I mean, as you say, you leave the academic world. That's interesting because I was going to ask you, what prompted you to leave that? I think you've explained that you wanted to kind of spread your wings and get more into broadcasting. But during the 80s, you write a very different book, The Russian Album. And you talked about, which is really about the background of your father's family, these white Russians. By that you mean, I thought you meant Mensheviks. Is that what you meant? No.
Oh, no. They're not Mensheviks, because Mensheviks are socialists or a variety of communists. No, my grandparents were old white Russian aristocrats. My grandmother was a princess, and my grandfather was a count. And my grandfather was actually the last minister of education in the government of Tsar Nicholas II, and held the post between 1915 and 1917 as the Eastern Front collapsed, and he tried to keep the schools going through the horror of the First World War. And then when the February Revolution came, they fled south to take refuge from the Civil War, and then escaped to Britain in 1919, and then from Britain eventually to Canada. And the Russian Album, the book you mentioned, was an attempt to make sense of that. I wrote it in the mid-'80s because my father was getting on, and I wanted to make sure that I had the story straight. And so I made myself a kind of family historian for that period. And I'm certainly glad I did, because my father then died in 1989, but I had most of it kind of done by then. And I think I just, you do want to know where you come from. It's a mysterious, you want to root yourself on the ground. I think in my own life, I was newly married. I had moved out of the security of Cambridge into a kind of more uncertain freelance life. I had, in any freelance life, 4 pots on the stove, hoping one would come to the boil at the right moment. I think, Johnny, you may know about that. And so I think this search for roots was a search for a certain kind of security and stability. What I took from my grandparents' experience was an enormous appreciation for their resilience and lack of recrimination. One of the lesson I took from their exile was that they didn't spend time looking backwards and regretting and plotting against the new Bolshevik dispensation. They wanted their children. They had 5 sons, of whom my father was the youngest. They wanted these boys to start a completely new life in a new country, and they supported. And I admire that tremendously. This capacity to not be shut into a kind of prison of recrimination, regret, and nostalgia. And I found kind of wonderful about this past, not the old glories and but the way they survived exile was what I found most kind of inspiring to me and helpful, in fact.
Mm. Yeah, because a book like that is always going to be very personal, but it's interesting you talk about that, because it seemed to be as much a self-discovery for yourself as it was about looking into the history of your father's side of the family. And you talk about why you were more interested in that than your mother's side, maybe because you were kind of moving into this more rootless lifestyle yourself. So there's a lot of things going on.
Sure. Yes, it was at the time, it was a statement in a way of allegiance to my father's side. I now think that's a bit crazy. I mean, I'm all of us are formed by 2 pasts, at least, not one. And my mother's past turned out much later to be just as important to me as my father's. But at the time, I needed daddy. I can't even explain all the reasons, but.
Well, it kind of looked more glamorous, I imagine, as well, wasn't this?
Well, yeah, I think that's true. And there were, and also family pasts are mysterious. You've got a piece of jewelry, or you got an old book, or you got an old photograph, and they're kind of miscellaneous clues to a puzzle that you want to put together. And I think a lot of that was going on. Just put the puzzle together so I can understand how it happened. I should say, it's kind of comic in a way, that my brother, who's 3 years younger than me and is a better family historian than I am, has a completely different account of our family past than I do. So my pretension to be the official family historian of the Ignatieff family has been blown out of the water long, because there are plenty of errors and mistakes, or I didn't understand this, or I didn't. And so my brother and I have this kind of dialogue in which he tells me how much I didn't quite get right. And that's another part of the comedy of family history, is that each son lays claim to the definitive account, and there is no definitive account. There's only his account and my account and the dialogue that goes on between them.
Yes, yeah. By the way, has he written a book? Is he written on this, or is
no?
Okay. Okay. Well, then, Michael, you're in this freelance world. You're working. I think you're quite involved with the Observer, and we now go into the 90s, which happens to coincide with the last years of Isaiah Berlin's life, and who you write the official biography of. And that gets published shortly after he dies. But before we talk about that biography, you've mentioned your father knew Isaiah. Was that how you knew him and how you built your relationship with him in the 80s and 90s?
Well, the story of how we met is interesting, because it occurred during my broadcasting career. I was asked to comment on a controversy that had emerged at the Royal Court Theatre in London about whether they should put on a play about Jewish collaboration in the Holocaust, that is, the ways in which the Jewish associations in major European cities under Nazi occupation collaborated with Nazi occupation authorities to deliver lists of Jews for deportation. It's a terrible, dark period in the Second World War. And I was asked to comment on a play that had been written about this. And I commented on British television to the effect that, of course, you should make a play about this because it's the most tragic and difficult issues in European history. But if you're going to do it, please don't turn it into a tendentious piece of anti-Zionist propaganda, which is what this play was, in my judgment. So I said that. And on Monday morning, I got a letter from Isaiah Berlin saying, Isaiah Berlin, All Souls. I happened to see what you said and agree with it, and hope you'll come and see me at All Souls. And this was in 1985, and it was the beginning of our friendship. And that starting point's important because I'm not Jewish, and he obviously is a Jewish sage, but I think he wanted to see right away that I was sound on certain fundamental issues. And so a lot of the hidden story of the biography is that it's a white Russian non-Jew writing the life of a Russian Jew, and the very complicated way in which two sides establish trust in each other. My Isaiah turned out to know a tremendous amount about my great-grandfather and grandfather. And it's a complicated story because my great-grandfather was a religious anti-Semite who signed the legislation that resulted in the expulsion of and the emigration of millions of Jews from Russia in the 1880s. So he knew about that. And the name Ignatieff figures very darkly in certain histories of the Jewish people in the 19th century for perfectly sound reasons. My grandfather, on the other hand, the Minister of Education, was in fact fought the anti-Semitic prejudices of his time. For example, this is the kind of story that convinces you that the Russian Revolution had to happen. A Jewish guy fights for the Tsar, wins the medal for valor, and then is not allowed to enroll in a university in Moscow. And my grandfather, forces them to admit this Jewish hero into the university. And in fact, my grandfather's life, I think, was saved by the fact that when he was eventually arrested during the revolution, many of the Bolsheviks in the small town where he was were ex-school teachers, and they remembered that he had been a decent and humane Minister of the Education, and therefore did not order him to be executed along with a lot of other Tsarist arrestees. So Isaiah seemed to know all of this. That is, my family has a very complicated relationship to the Jews of Russia. And he wanted, I think, to be sure that I had come out on the right side on these questions. I should say, talking about it this way gives a slightly wrong appearance because none of this was ever said. This is all me putting it together later as I realized that he inched his way towards me and I inched my way towards him over a period of about 12 years where none of this was ever discussed. But clearly, we became friends. I was never a student of his. He knew my father because my father had studied PPE with him in the 30s when he came to Oxford as a Canadian Rhodes Scholar. And they'd maintain a connection afterwards. But I became a friend of his. I didn't feel I was a student. I didn't feel I was an acolyte. I didn't feel I was a courtier. I felt I was a friend, which is one of the nicest things about him. He had an enormous gift for friendship. And so I would go to the Albany, his very elite residence in Piccadilly, and show up, and I'd sit down beside him in a big comfy chair, and there were books all around him and nuts and tea cups and everything, and we just start talking, and he loved to talk, and he knew by then that I interviewed people on television, so he kind of understood that I had some professional competence in this area. And very slowly out of this, the idea came that initially would I record his life so that somebody could eventually write a biography? And I agreed to do that. And then recording it was hilarious. You'd walk in and you'd ask him one question. You'd say, Isaiah, could you talk about your memories of the February Revolution in 1917? And you press record, and an hour later, he'd still be going, the detail of and another thing and another thing. But it was, a river of memory and joking and funny and amusing and digressive, but somehow coherent, rather like some of his essays. The way he speaks is the way it comes out on the page, and it was, delightful. And I recorded him very badly, to the frustration of all people, possibly you, Johnny, have come after and listened to the tapes, because they're very badly recorded. And I should have, it's 1985, I should have been, got a professional mic and all this kind of stuff. So I think will frustrate future biographers. I had no desire to burn my tracks for other people. And Henry Hardy, his wonderful editor, is, I think, very frustrated with me, with my biographical incompetence. But we got the basic interview materials down, and then he asked me to write the biography, and I decided to do so. But and then I had access to the huge, then unsorted correspondence that was in the Wolfson archives. And that's an important fact. I mean, Henry Hardy, the editor, had not yet put together the volumes of his correspondence. This was 20 years before that. So these letters would just pour out on the table, and I kind of picked, there was just no way you could do it unless you were very selective. And so the biography is a selective first attempt at a biography. It's more a biographical essay in a way and the record of a friendship between two people of different generations and cultures. But it has, it's had a life as such, and it was, he became, I think, next to my father, the human being in this world that I became closest to. It was, to call it a labor of love is simply to say I loved him. I just thought he was a wonderful man. Childish, childlike, funny, sharp, malicious, very aware of his reputation, very aware of his limitations. But above all, I think that a force of nature in his vitality. I've never met a human being with more vitality than Isaiah, more sheer delight in living. And I think that was, I'm a sort of gloomy person in a way. And he was bubbling with life in a way that almost everybody found intoxicating to be around. And he was also deeply curious. I remember sitting on a bus, hopping on a bus, a 19 bus, in the days when you could hop on and there were still conductors. I remember him talking to the conductor and learning about the conductor's life, thinking about him, reminiscing about the London of times past and all this. He just constantly reaching out to life to pull into his own experience, other people's experience. And that was fantastic. I mean, I don't. I hope I've conveyed a tiny bit of that in the book, because it's the aspect of him that I most admire and respect. His attitude to life itself was just wonderful.
Yes, and I think, I mean, your book, you don't need me to say it's a lovely book, and it was critically acclaimed. It's been very widely read, and I think it actually does display something that Henry Hardy, you mentioned there, says about Isaiah, where he said he had a genius for being human.
Yes.
I think is a nice way of describing it.
Yeah.
You mentioned there it was written, very soon after Isaiah was, died, and as you say, the letters. Now that half the letters have been published, and other stuff has been other material, is there anything that has changed your view of Isaiah in the intervening period since you wrote that book? Anything that you feel, nah, I didn't know that, or I should have emphasized that more?
I think not fundamentally, Johnny, which may be maybe something that will be held against me, but I do plan to put out another edition of the book, because I'm troubled by the fact that there are errors, just errors of fact, or, I don't basically feel like shifting my interpretations. And in one particular respect, I feel I've made a contribution, and that's the chapter on his Jewishness was important to me, because I think it's very much the core of his achievement as a human being, is that I hadn't realized, being non-Jewish, the enormous pressure on him and on Jews and everybody to be a certain kind of Jew. And because he became famous very early in his 20s, because he was elected to All Souls, and he was the first Jew to be elected to All Souls, he became a kind of celebrity in the Jewish community. So everybody wants him to be more Zionist than he is, or more anti-Zionist than he is, or live in Israel and he doesn't want to, or, he's pushed and pulled in terms of his relationship to the Jewish reality. He's criticized for being a kind of elitist. He's also criticized cruelly for being a court Jew, the kind of Jew who curries favor with the Gentiles. And so it's a very, very complicated area for him. And what I took from it is that this is crucial to his definition of liberalism. It's crucial to why he's a liberal. Because what he basically says to all of these people in the nicest and most amusing possible way is, I will decide what kind of Jew I am going to be. Right? And there's an intransigence at the core of him about this that is, I think, the core of him as a human being, is that freedom for him was essential, because the Gentiles wanted him to be a certain kind of Jew. The Jews wanted him to be a certain kind of Jew. And he is Jewish, but he doesn't want to have Jewishness claim all of him. Mm. He doesn't want to see the whole world through a Jewish lens. But Jewishness is, and so he has all these things that infuriate people. He says, the Orthodox synagogue is the synagogue I am not attending, meaning if I am Jewish, I observe the high holy days, but I do not attend synagogue. I have doctrinal difficulties, but I'm a Jew. I'm also a religious observant Jew. All of this, but I will be the person who makes these calls, and I will create this persona. And I think it, in a way, that's, I think, the core of the book for me, and the core of my understanding of him. And I should add that it taught me an enormous amount about personal identity. I mean, I just thought, this is what it is to live a life and be a human being. You have to stake out the claim of what kind of person you are vis-a-vis all the historical, religious, confessional claims upon you. And your job as a human being is to sort that out and come to some resolution. And those who do find a resolution and bring these pieces together, have a happy life. And those who don't are tormented, pushed and pulled and tossed and turned on the storms of other people's claims upon you. And that's what I took from Isaiah. He said, you got to sort that stuff out. And it took him a lifetime. It was often very difficult. But the serene Isaiah of old age is a man who's fought many a battle to achieve that serenity. So I don't see, I mean, there are people who see him as a kind of complacent, old, elite, member of the British the British elite, kind of out of touch with the world. But this struggle to be Isaiah, it seems to me, is enduringly relevant.
Yes, this kind of irreducible individuality that he wants to hold on to, that I'm not going to let anyone assimilate. And the other thing that you mentioned there that confirms that he wasn't one of these people that was in the establishment in that bad sense was that, well, he made a point of contacting you, and more probably dramatically, he made a point of contacting me who was even more of an unknown. And he responded to my letter, and I met him a couple of times.
Yes. People
that normally are in those sort of echelons on the establishment wouldn't want to meet someone like me because I'm a nobody. And yet he always seemed to meet these people, unknowns, and was open to talking to people.
It's an important point. You're certainly not an unknown, Johnny, but it's symptomatic of his kind of ecumenical view about human life. He was prepared to talk to anybody and learn from anybody. And some of his most revealing letters are letters to completely anonymous people. And that's enormously to his credit, and something that I think we should all try to emulate.
Definitely, yeah. If we move on now, Michael, to the noughties, and this opens a completely new chapter in your life, an unexpected one. And I want to spend some time on this because you capture it very well in your book Fire and Ashes, which is your entry into politics. And maybe just to kick off this section, and you describe it quite well in your book, you got the call to enter the political fray, and amazingly, you said yes instantly, which threw me. And then you describe that. So maybe if you can set the context to those who don't know this episode of your life, and what made you say yes so quickly?
Well, I still find it a bit puzzling, in fact, as I look back on it. And I think it's a place where I may have made a pretty serious mistake. But why it felt instantaneous, why I felt the yes was so easy, is that I am a Canadian. I am the son of a man who served in the Canadian government for 40 years. I am a man who revered Mike Pearson, a man who didn't revere, but admired Pierre Trudeau, a man whose liberalism is Canadian. You take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. It really is very deep in me. And I think I was in my 50s at that point. It was kind of now or never. And these people came to me and said, the liberal ship is burning and it's about to sink in the water and we need a new captain. And I was, I think, seduced by the attention and by the respect and all that kind of stuff. I radically underestimated what a change it would mean in my life. I radically underestimated how difficult it would be. But I somehow had confidence that these young people could get me there. I didn't understand that we would have to fight our way in. The incumbent prime minister at the time wouldn't give me the time of day, so we had to blast our way into the party against pretty ferocious opposition. Some of it very unpleasant. But I am a fighter, up to a point. I like a fight. I felt this was an opportunity to prove myself. I think many intellectuals like me have a kind of slightly sentimental respect for men and women of action. We kind of think we sit on the sidelines, and we long to be in the fray, in the battlefield. And so some of that was in play. I also think I was hubristic in the extreme. I thought I was, articulate, smart, blah, blah, blah. Why I would be irresistibly good at all this, and discovered, in fact, that I was good at some of it, but lousy at other things. Lousy in the sense that I often couldn't read a room very well. I didn't have a kind of sixth sense for, one of the key political skills, and is a rather cynical one, which is the ability to distinguish between what people say and what they really mean, between what people say and what they actually want. A great politician, when someone comes into the room, knows immediately that the guy may be saying something, but he wants something. What is it he wants? What can I give him? What can't I give him? Why is it in my interest to give him? Why is it in my interest not to give him? This immediate sense of the political dimensions of every encounter. That's one thing I think I had a very poor grasp of. I didn't have that skill at all. I was naive and trusting and downright stupid about some people. I think the other thing I absolutely didn't understand, and I do talk about this in the book, was that when you go from the conversation we're having now, where I'm Johnny, I'm telling you what comes into my head, and I try and form it and shape it, but I'm not thinking, what is Johnny thinking about this? I'm just talking to you. But in politics, it's a completely different business. Every word coming out of your mouth is a political act, and one missed sentence can sink you as a politician. And I made some remarks that caused me enormous difficulties, and so getting that instinctive self-control and discipline, in which you understand that all speech, every word out of your mouth, is a political statement that can be held against you or can do you good, depending on how you pitch it. I was not very good at that, and I occasionally, not too often, but occasionally really stepped in it. And when you step in it, it causes difficulty because people start to think, is he the guy really? This guy keeps making mistakes, and then that drains away support. So there were things I was good at. I could give a speech. I could, I actually like people. People doubt that about me, but I'm actually extremely curious about people and love the people I met in politics. But I wasn't good at some of the skills, and I've mentioned some of those. So I went in thinking I'd be wonderful, thinking I'd come home, thinking it would be a fantastic welcome. And then, forgot that, all politics is local. So the first question people want to know is, where have you been? Where are you really a Canadian? Aren't you? You're sort of in the States, aren't you? And doesn't that make you an American? Well, being an American in Canada is kind of fatal, and I've never been anything other than a Canadian. But so where have you been all this time? Why have you been a Canadian making your life outside of the country? And I didn't understand how substantive a problem that was. I should have. You come back, you haven't been around, and suddenly you think you can be prime minister. What kind of arrogant jerk are you? So there's a lot of resistance. So I worked extremely hard for 5.5 years, made a lot of friends, gave it everything I had for 60, 70 hours a week. I have the great good fortune of doing it with my wife, Susanna, who turned out to be fantastic at the business of politics, in some ways better than me, with better instinctive judgment about people than I have. And so that was a huge asset. We had hundreds and hundreds of people working for us, and some of them, have remained friends ever since. So, but it was a tough go, and at the end, it ended in defeat. And so it ended in defeat after about 6 years, and then I came out. So that's the story.
Mm. I mean, a very sobering and humbling story. Um, that your chapter in politics, and as you describe it there, I mean, there was obviously the final kind of denouement, but you're suggesting also that you kind of sensed before that happened that you saw you didn't have what it takes to be a really successful politician, and that a good brain and being articulate only gets you so far,
Sure.
and
I think
you
it's
need a
also,
bigger bag of tricks.
yeah, I think it's also, I didn't want to have what it takes.
Okay.
I didn't want it enough. I mean, one of the great features of great politicians is they want it all the time. They want it 24/7. They want it from the minute they get up to the minute they go to bed. They want nothing else. I'd done a lot of things in my life and turned out to love doing them. And so there was a certain part of me that kept looking backwards and thinking, well, what was so bad about being a professor at Harvard? What,
Yeah.
turned out to be pretty wonderful, and especially in retrospect. So I think that was an issue. It was not merely that I lacked certain skills, and I've tried to be clear about that, but I also lacked, I think, that deep, burning desire to want this rather than wanting anything else. And that, I think, was that was a feature.
Yeah. It's something, because I've worked in the commercial world for about 25 years, and you see it with the most senior people in the company. The
Sure.
person that becomes CEO, they have that killer instinct, and if
Sure.
that's all you're thinking about, you're probably going to get there.
Sure. Sure.
But what I want to maybe talk a little bit about more before we leave this topic is that you are still one of the few political thinkers who went into politics, and even though it wasn't a great success, you learned an awful lot that most political thinkers never learn. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, or get you to talk about that, and through the prism, I think this time, of maybe Machiavelli and Max Weber, because they are the two thinkers that kind of shine through in your book. You kind of just say that of all the books that are written on politics, The Prince is probably the one that helped you most, or is most relevant. And then when you come to the end of your book, it's Max Weber's Politics as a Vocation that you kind of end on, which I thought was, so maybe if you could talk about both of those thinkers.
Well, Machiavelli, I think, helped me to understand the sense of politics as a performance. Machiavelli is unequaled in his description of what the public persona of a prince requires, and unequaled in his description of the fact that the public persona and what the private person is may be two completely different things, which is why he's widely accused of kind of endorsing hypocrisy and cynicism and whatever. And I think it's much more interesting than that. I think he says you can, you can be any kind of person you want to be, and you should hopefully be a good person and even a Christian person. But if you're in politics, brother, you've got to be a certain kind of, there's certain speech acts required of you. There's also a certain sprezzatura. You've got to give the impression that this is easy and you're at home and you love doing it, and you radiate confidence and radiate charm and radiate command. And I think he's unequaled in his description of that as the performance of politics. I also think, switching to Weber, that Weber is unequaled in his description of politics as a calling, in the sense that your whole being has to be informed by a desire to be a political leader. And then he, in addition to that, I think has a wonderful description of the moral demands of leadership, which is a an ethics of responsibility in which you have to both perform the act of leadership, but you have to restrain your own desire to be, a hero, to be because that way demagoguery lies. You have to display responsibility towards those who put you there. You have to display responsibility to your own moral core, and you have to display responsibility to history. That is, you have to have a sense of how history will judge your actions and take responsibility not just for tomorrow but for the very long term. And it's the greatest, description of that in the political canon, I think. And so I felt that both Machiavelli and Weber actually confirmed the deep and enduring relevance of these texts for actual practical political life. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think this is just a kind of text that some damn professor is marching me through on my path through undergraduate life. No, these texts are absolutely describe what it's like to be in the engine room.
Yes. And I mean, like Machiavelli, both of you went into politics and have written about it, which, there's parallels there. Okay, thanks, Michael. We now move towards the kind of more recent years. After, obviously, you went into politics, you took up a number of prestigious chairs in New York and Toronto. And then you, as you say, you've mentioned you took up the rectorship of the Central European University, starting in Budapest. You came at a very eventful time, sadly eventful, and now, as you say, you're based in Vienna. But probably more to the fore now, you've just written this book on Consolation. And before I ask you maybe to read a passage from it, could you, it's a topic, Consolation, that has great minds have written about over the ages, maybe starting Boethius most famously and then right up to today. What made you write this book on this topic now?
Well, Johnny, I think it's always a difficult question to answer honestly. The sources that drive you. I mean, there's one obvious line would be, I am still seeking to console myself from deep failure in the political domain. So this book is a response to political failure. But that feels a bit kind of crude in a way. Yes, I had disappointments in failing at politics, but I've had 10 years to get over it, and nobody died, and I actually have very positive feelings about having done it. So that won't quite do. Some of it, I think, was just contingent. As I say in the book, I went to a concert minding my own business and was asked to give a lecture in a choral concert, the performance of the Psalms by some great choirs, and found myself swept away by the words which were projected over the stage and by the power of the music. And I began to think about why it is that religious languages of consolation, the Psalms, seem to be so soothing or provide such comfort to the audience that I was part of and myself. I felt deeply moved. And, all of us carry around us, whether we're religious or not, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. These images in the Psalms structure our understanding of so much, including the prospect of dying. And that started the project off. I began simply looking at why it was that religious language retains the power to console those who don't have religious faith. And my answer was that these works do two things. They convey such a clear and burning understanding of what we need consolation for. The consolation is provided by a sense of kinship and solidarity with the psalmists. We don't know who they were, but they know what we are going through. And that sense of they know what we're going through is one of the reasons why people keep reading the Psalms, even if they don't believe in the consolations that they provide. They are consoled by the fact these people know who I am. They know what I'm suffering. They know what my loneliness and despair is. And consolation is above all this sense of solidarity. When we console someone, we are with someone. We console them with our presence, with words if we can. We try to give meaning to an experience of suffering and loss that leaves them feeling solitary and alone. The core of despair, the core of depression is solitude, the sense that nobody understands what I'm going through, not even me. And consolation is the attempt to demonstrate that I know, I've been there. I've been there. I understand what you're going through. And the Psalms have that capacity. And then as I began to look, I began to see everywhere in the Western tradition great works, many of whom are not customarily regarded as works of consolation, can be seen as attempts to provide this solidarity in suffering that I think is the core of consolation as an experience.
Okay, well, thank you for that nice description, Michael. If I could now ask you maybe to read a section of the book on which we'll end this interview.
Sure. You wanted me to read a section of the book about a Hungarian poet, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Hungary, October 1944. Farm workers pause in their work in the fields to watch a column of men passing by on the road. A Hungarian labor service brigade, mostly composed of Jews, being marched back from a copper mine in Serbia across the Hungarian countryside. Their work uniforms are ragged. They are a brown and gray river of bodies, some stumbling and falling, others struggling to pick their fellows up and carry them along. Uniformed guards, mostly Hungarians, under the control of the German SS, patrol up and down, and the watching workers see men falling in the ditch, hear shots ring out until the column disappears over the horizon. As he stumbles along, one of the prisoners puts words together, assembles phrases, and commits them to memory. They've been on the march for days. In the distance, they can hear the thunder of the approaching Russian divisions. The war will surely soon be over, and they will make it home to their families. At night, lying on the bare ground of a brickyard among the ragged, sleeping men, he takes out a small notebook and writes down 7 lines in a meticulous, neat hand, conjuring into life the workers in the fields who had watched them pass. With laconic irony, he titles the poem Picture Postcard. At 9 kilometers, the pall of burning, hayrick, homestead, farm. At the field's edge, the peasants, silent, smoking, pipes against the fear of harm. Here, a lake, ruffled only by the step of a tiny shepherdess, is what the ruffled sheep drink in their lowliness. He had procured the notebook by bartering his last cigarettes with Serbian villagers who came to the wire of the Heidenau camp. On the march home, he keeps writing in the hope that he will see his wife Fanny again. Of her, he had written, "You whose calm is as the weight and sureness of a psalm." As he stumbles along, he dreams of her, of verandas, of plum jam, of the stillness of late summer in sun-dappled gardens. He has survived months of hard labor in the copper mine, and when the guards started them on the march, he might have hoped that the journey would take him home. But as the days passed, he begins to understand the truth. On the night of October 7-8, 1944, at a brickyard in Serbia near the Hungarian border, the SS guards order the prisoners to lie down and empty their pockets of valuables. They machine gun half their captives. A Budapest cabaret violinist topples to his knees, and as the prisoner tries to help him, the guards shoot the violinist in the neck. The prisoner falls behind him and lies still, not moving. He hears the guard speaking German just above his head. The SS and their Hungarian associates then forced the survivors to their feet to resume the march. They are not going home, they now realize, but to labor camps in Germany. By October 24, they are halfway across Hungary, and he has time at night to write another picture postcard. The oxen drool saliva mixed with blood. Each one of us is urinating blood. The squad stands about in knots, stinking, mad. Death, hideous, is blowing overhead. By now, they are marching northeast toward the border of the German Reich. The guards make them pitch camp on the tarmac of an abandoned airfield. And while the remnant of men lies sleeping, the prisoner takes a piece of cardboard he picked up on the road. On the back, an advertisement for cod liver oil. And he writes another picture postcard, this time describing his own encounter with death days before. I fell beside him, and his corpse turned over, tight already as a snapping string, shot in the neck. And that's how you will end too, I whispered to myself. Lie still, no moving. Now patience flowers in death. Then I would hear Der Spring noch auf above and very near. Blood mixed with mud was drying on my ear. He copies the 7 lines into his notebook and dates it October 31, 1944. It is the last entry. One of the survivors of the column who returned home from Germany later said that he last saw the prisoner sitting alone on the tarmac of the airfield, staring down at his dilapidated boots. On November 8th, the Hungarian guards filled 2 carts full of prisoners no longer able to walk, among them the poet, and took them to local hospitals at a town near the German-Hungarian border. The hospitals turned the dying men away. Then the 4 Hungarian guards trundled the carts out to the woods outside of town, shot the prisoners in the back of their heads, and tipped their bodies into a shallow grave. In August 1946, the poet's wife Fanny was informed that bodies had been exhumed and some of her husband's personal effects had been found near the town where he had last been seen alive. These effects had been handed over to a local butcher, the leader of the town's Jewish community. When she went to the butcher shop, he gave her a brown paper parcel. When she unwrapped it, she found a wallet with his photograph and hers, his insurance card, a picture of his mother as a young woman, and the notebook. On the inside page was a message the poet had addressed in 5 languages, Hungarian, English, French, German, and Serbo-Croatian, informing anyone who found it that it contained the work of a Hungarian poet. When Fanny turned the pages, she found the postcards written out in his steady, unvarying hand. Fanny never recovered her husband's body or gave him a proper burial, but she did live long enough to see Miklos Radnoti recognized as one of the greatest poets of Hungary and Europe. There was indeed an answer to the last line of one of his poems. But tell me, did the work survive? His poetry is taught in Hungarian schools to this day. His act of witness also ensured that the suffering of his comrades in the labor service gang would not be forgotten. Like Akhmatova, like Primo Levi, his act of witness was also a judgment that their countries still are reluctant to accept. Radnoti's work was incorporated into the national canon of Hungary, but the uncomfortable fact remains that the guards who murdered him were Hungarian. In the early 2000s, when Fanny was well into her 80s, her husband's biographer asked her whether the pain of losing him had diminished over time. She shook her head. Did she know, the biographer went on, the poem by Emily Dickinson? They say that time assuages. Time never did assuage. An actual suffering strengthens as sinews do with age. Time is a test of trouble, but not a remedy. If such it prove too there was no malady. Fanny nodded again. Yes, she did know the poem.